Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you're from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Stopped Train at Lower Bay. The fluorescent lights of the TTC maintenance depot buzzed overhead as Liam Carter signed out his equipment checklist. 3 a.m. shifts were nothing new to him. After 23 years working Toronto's subway tunnels, he'd grown comfortable with the underground darkness, the rhythmic clatter of distant trains, the smell of brake dust and electrical ozone that permeated every platform and service corridor. Tonight's assignment was routine. Structural inspection of Lower Bay Station, the ghost platform that had been closed to the public since 1966. The abandoned station served as a filming location now, a relic of Toronto's transit history preserved in perpetual twilight. Liam had been down there dozens of times, checking track integrity, testing ventilation systems, ensuring the forgotten station remained structurally sound even as the city above evolved and expanded. He gathered his tools, flashlight, multimeter, track gauge, camera for documentation, and made his way through the access tunnel that connected the active Bay station to its abandoned twin. The temperature dropped as he descended, his breath misting slightly in the stale air. The walls here still bore their original 1960s tile work, cream and brown patterns that had once guided commuters, but now led only to emptiness. The platform of Lower Bay opened before him, exactly as he remembered it. Vintage advertisements for products that no longer existed lined the curved walls. A faded poster promoted a department store that had closed in the 1970s. Another advertised a film festival from decades past. The benches were original wood and metal, the kind that had been replaced throughout the active system years ago. Everything was frozen in time, a capsule of mid-century Toronto transit infrastructure. Liam's flashlight beam swept across the platform as he approached the track edge. His boots echoed in the cavernous space. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the muffled rumble of an active train passing through the connected tunnels, a reminder that the living transit system pulsed just beyond these abandoned walls. He knelt beside the northbound track, running his gloved hand along the rail. Cold steel, slightly dusty but structurally sound. He checked the fish plates connecting the rail sections, looking for stress fractures or displacement. Everything appeared normal. He stood, preparing to move further down the platform, when he noticed something that stopped him cold. Light was reflecting off the rails about 50 meters down the tunnel. Not the diffuse glow of emergency lighting or his flashlight, but something brighter, more focused. His first thought was that another maintenance worker had entered from the opposite access point, but that made no sense. He would have been notified. The work schedule showed only him assigned to this location tonight. Liam walked along the platform, his flashlight aimed toward the source of the illumination. As he drew closer, the shape began to resolve itself into something impossible. A subway car sat on the tracks, its interior lights blazing, exactly like the old Gloucester cars that had run these lines in the 60s, but had been retired and scrapped decades ago. His heart rate increased. This had to be one of the heritage vehicles, he reasoned. Sometimes they brought old rolling stock down here for filming or special events, but no one had mentioned anything in the work orders. And how would they have powered it? These tracks were dead. The third rail had been deactivated when the station closed nearly 60 years ago. He reached the point on the platform directly adjacent to the stopped train. Up close, it was even more pristine than it had appeared from a distance. The red and white livery gleamed as if freshly painted. The windows were clear, unmarred by decades of grime. Through them, he could see the interior worn leather straps hanging from the ceiling, metal poles running floor to ceiling, advertisements for products and services from another era. And passengers. The car was full of passengers, Liam's breath caught in his throat. People sat in neat rows, facing forward, hands folded in laps or gripping the poles. Men in fedoras and wool coats, women in modest dresses with structured shoulders and narrow waists, a teenager in saddle shoes and a poodle skirt. All of them perfectly still, staring straight ahead with wide, unblinking eyes. He pressed closer to the window, his flashlight illuminating the interior. The passengers didn't react to the light, didn't turn their heads, didn't move at all. Their faces were waxy, pale, completely expressionless, like mannequins arranged in a tableau, except their eyes held a glassiness that suggested something that had once been alive. Liam rapped on the window with his knuckles. The sound echoed flatly. None of the passengers responded. He could see their chests now, watching for the rise and fall of breathing. Nothing. Absolutely still. Yet they couldn't be mannequins, the detail was too perfect. He could see the texture of skin, the individual hairs, the fine lines around eyes and mouths. A hydraulic hiss made him jump back from the window. The doors of the subway car were opening, sliding apart with a smooth mechanical precision. The sound was impossibly loud in the dead station, the squeal of metal against metal that every Toronto commuter knew intimately. Warm air rushed out from the interior of the car, carrying with it a scent that made Liam's stomach turn. Not the expected mustiness of age, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in a warm room. Like decay masked by industrial cleaner. The passengers remained frozen, but now Liam could see into the car more clearly. The floor was clean, the seats were intact. Everything appeared exactly as it would have in 1966, maintained in perfect condition. Except for the passengers, who sat in their unnatural stillness, eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. Liam knew he should leave. Should radio for backup, report this impossibility, let someone else determine what was happening. But 23 years of procedure and protocol drew him forward. Unauthorized persons in a closed station was a serious safety issue. Even if these people were dead, and he was increasingly certain they were, he needed to document the scene, needed to understand what he was looking at. He stepped into the car. The doors hissed shut behind him immediately, closing with a finality that sent panic shooting through his chest. He spun, grabbing for the emergency release, but the mechanism didn't respond. The doors remained sealed. A mechanical voice crackled through ancient speakers. "Next stop, Union Station." That was wrong. Lower Bay had never connected directly to Union. The line ran through Museum, Queen's Park, St. George. The voice was delivering information from a route that had never existed. The train began to move. Liam grabbed a pole to steady himself as the car lurched forward, accelerating smoothly into the tunnel. The lights of Lower Bay platform fell away behind them, and they plunged into darkness. But this wasn't the darkness of the regular tunnels. This was absolute, complete, a blackness so total that it seemed to press against the windows like a physical presence. He looked at the passengers around him. They still hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged his presence. But their eyes had changed. They were no longer staring ahead. They were looking at him. Every single face had turned in unison, and every pair of eyes was locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The woman in the poodle skirt sat closest to him. Her lipstick was a bright, arterial red against skin that had gone gray. Her eyes were clouded like cataracts, but they tracked his movement as he stepped backward. A man in a fedora opened his mouth. Liam expected words, but what emerged was a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire, a long, slow exhale that carried the stench of rot. One by one, the other passengers joined in, their mouths opening in unison, creating a chorus of exhalation that filled the car with the smell of death. Liam pressed himself against the door, fumbling for his radio. His fingers found only the empty clip on his belt. The radio was gone. His flashlight was gone. His tools were gone. Everything he'd brought into the station had vanished. The train picked up speed, rattling through the impossible tunnel. Through the windows, Liam could see lights beginning to appear in the darkness. Not the regularly spaced tunnel lights he knew, but something else. They looked like street lights, glowing at regular intervals, illuminating what appeared to be platforms and stations. But these weren't Toronto subway stations. The architecture was wrong, twisted. The platforms were empty except for dark shapes that might have been people, or might have been something else. Signs hung from the ceilings, but the letters weren't in any language Liam recognized. They squirmed and reformed as he tried to read them, never settling into coherent words. The mechanical voice announced again. "Arriving at Union Station. Doors will open on the right." The train began to slow. Through the windows, Liam could see the next platform approaching. It was vast, stretching into darkness in both directions, the ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. Figures stood on the platform, hundreds of them, all perfectly still, all facing the arriving train. All wearing the same clothes as the passengers in his car. Fedoras and wool coats, dresses with structured shoulders. The fashion of 60 years ago, worn by people who had been waiting on this platform for longer than Liam had been alive. The train slid to a stop with mechanical precision. The doors hissed open. The passengers around him stood in unison, their movements jerky and wrong, like puppets being pulled upright by invisible strings. They shuffled toward the open doors, their feet making wet, dragging sounds against the floor. The woman in the poodle skirt paused as she passed him. Her head rotated on her neck with a grinding sound, turning to face him fully. Her mouth opened wider than should have been possible, jaw unhinging like a snake's, and words emerged in a voice that sounded like they were being played backward on an old tape recorder. "Welcome home," she said. "Welcome to the city beneath." The passengers filed off the train and onto the platform, joining the waiting crowd. And the crowd began to board, shuffling into the car with that same wrong, puppet-like movement. They smelled of earth and mold and something chemical that burned Liam's nostrils. He had seconds before they filled the car completely. He lunged for the open door, throwing himself through the gap just as a hand, cold and impossibly strong, grabbed his ankle. He kicked hard, felt his boot connect with something that gave like rotten wood, and broke free. Liam hit the platform rolling, scrambling to his feet as the doors hissed shut behind him. The train pulled away, accelerating into the darkness, filled with its new cargo of waiting dead. He stood alone on the impossible platform, surrounded by towering pillars that stretched into shadow, watching the train's lights disappear into the tunnel. The silence that followed was absolute. No rumble of distant trains, no hum of electrical systems, just silence, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Ahead, beyond the edge of the platform, he could see more lights. They illuminated what appeared to be streets, stretching away into darkness. Buildings rose on either side, their windows glowing with a sickly yellow light. It looked like a city, laid out in a grid pattern, but it was all underground, carved into the rock beneath Toronto. A city that had been here all along, hidden beneath the regular tunnels. A city where trains that should have been scrapped decades ago still ran their routes. A city where the passengers who had died in accidents or heart attacks or quiet despair aboard those trains never really left, never made it to their destinations, but instead ended up here, in this twilight reflection of the world above. Liam walked toward the edge of the platform, peering into the city beneath. He could see movement now, shapes passing through the streets, entering and exiting buildings. The architecture was familiar, but wrong. Like Toronto as designed by someone who had only heard it described, never seen it. The CN Tower stood in the distance, but it was inverted, hanging from the cavern ceiling like a massive stalactite. A sound behind him made him turn. Another train was approaching the platform, its lights growing brighter in the tunnel. This one was different modern rolling stock, the kind that ran through the city right now. It emerged into the station and slowed to a stop, doors opening with a familiar hydraulic hiss. Inside, the car was empty except for a single figure standing by the door. A TTC maintenance worker in a reflective vest and hard hat. He looked solid, real, alive. "Liam Carter," the figure said, and the voice was Liam's own voice, echoing slightly in the empty car. "Your shift ended hours ago. Time to clock out." The figure smiled, and it was Liam's smile, his face, his body. But the eyes were wrong. They were clouded and dead, like the passengers on the first train. Liam understood then. He looked down at his hands and saw they were translucent, fading, becoming less solid. He could see through them to the platform beneath. He tried to speak, to scream, but no sound emerged. The figure that wore his face stepped off the train and walked past him, heading toward the stairs that led up to the world above. It would take his place, Liam realized. It would clock out of his shift, drive his car home, sleep in his bed, and no one would know the difference. Liam looked back at the city beneath, at the twisted reflection of Toronto that sprawled in the darkness. This was where the train had been taking him all along, not to another station, but to another version of the city entirely. The version that existed underneath, where the dead rode trains that never stopped running, through tunnels that had no end. The mechanical voice announced overhead, "This train is now in service. Please stand clear of the closing doors." Liam Carter walked to the platform edge and looked down at the tracks. The third rail hummed with power that should not exist. In the distance, another train's lights approached. There would always be another train. The system ran 24 hours. The dead needed to get where they were going. He stepped off the platform and onto the tracks, and the approaching train's lights grew brighter, filling his vision with a light that promised nothing but an eternity of stops at stations that existed nowhere and everywhere. Beneath the city he had known, beneath the streets he had walked, in the spaces between the real and the forgotten. The train's horn blared once, twice, and then the world dissolved into the sound of wheels on rails and the mechanical voice announcing destinations that would never be reached. Story 2. The Mimic of Algonquin Park. Rachel Hayes wedged the last of her gear into the canoe's waterproof compartments, checking the straps twice before pushing off from the Cedar Lake access point. The morning sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber, and the park was quiet except for the call of loons echoing across the lake. This was what she came for, the isolation, the peace, the chance to disconnect from the noise of Ottawa and lose herself in the wilderness. 7 days. Just her canoe, and the vast interior of Algonquin Park. She had made this trip a dozen times, knew the routes and portages like the lines on her own palm. Rachel wasn't reckless. She had GPS, satellite phone for emergencies, bear spray, and enough experience to handle whatever the Canadian Shield wilderness could throw at her. The paddle cut through water as smooth as glass. She made good time, crossing Cedar Lake and navigating the narrow channel that led to the first portage. The canoe scraped against the rocky shore as she pulled it up onto the landing. 80 meters to the next lake. She could manage that in one trip with the yoke on her shoulders, gear secured inside. By late afternoon, she had put 3 lakes and 2 portages behind her, reaching a small, unnamed body of water that required local knowledge to find. It wasn't marked on the recreational maps, just a blue shape on the topographical chart she'd studied. The shoreline was rocky and steep, but she found a flat clearing back in the trees where previous campers had left a fire ring. Rachel set up her tent with practiced efficiency, strung a bear line for her food pack, gathered firewood. The ritual of making camp was meditative. Every action had purpose, every item its proper place. By the time the sun touched the tree line, she had a small fire going and water boiling for her dehydrated dinner. The forest sounds were familiar and comforting. Wind in the pines, the occasional splash of a beaver or otter, the chittering of red squirrels defending their territory. As darkness fell, she sat by the fire with a cup of tea, watching sparks spiral up toward the stars that were beginning to appear in the deepening blue sky. She was happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way that was difficult to find in the city. Out here, there were no deadlines, no emails, no expectations. Just the present moment, the warmth of the fire, the smell of pine smoke and clean water. Rachel extinguished the fire around 10, pouring water over the coals until they hissed, into silence. She hung her food pack, checked the perimeter of her camp, and climbed into her tent. The sleeping bag was warm and familiar, and she fell asleep to the sound of small waves lapping at the rocky shore. She woke to the sound of her name. Rachel. The voice was distant, muffled by the tent fabric, but unmistakable. It was Jen's voice. Jennifer Caldwell, her best friend since college, who was definitely not in Algonquin Park. Jen was in Ottawa, working her government job, probably asleep in her apartment 200 kilometers away. Rachel lay perfectly still in her sleeping bag, listening. The night had grown cold, and she could see her breath misting in the air. Outside the tent, the forest was silent. No wind, no animal sounds, just stillness and the memory of that voice calling her name. Rachel, are you there? Closer now. Maybe 20 meters away, from the direction of the lake. Jen's voice, but something was off about it. The inflection was right, the tone was familiar, but there was a hollowness to it, like listening to a recording played through a poor speaker. Rachel's rational mind cycled through explanations. Another camper? Maybe someone who happened to know someone named Rachel. Coincidence. But the voice was too accurate, too specifically Jen's voice down to the slight Ottawa Valley accent on the second syllable. Rachel, I'm cold. Can I come in? Her heart hammered against her ribs. That was exactly what Jen would say, the kind of playful request she'd make when showing up at Rachel's apartment unannounced. But Jen couldn't be here. It was impossible. Rachel found her headlamp and switched it on, the LED throwing harsh white light against the tent walls. She could see the shadows of trees through the fabric, but nothing moving. Nothing that looked human-shaped. Who's there? Her voice sounded thin and uncertain even to her own ears. Silence. The forest held its breath. Then, Rachel, it's me. It's Jen. I came to surprise you. I'm cold. Please let me into the tent. The voice was right outside now, just beyond the tent's vestibule. So close that if the fabric weren't there, they'd be face to face. Rachel stared at the zippered door, watching for movement, for the shadow of someone crouching there. Nothing. No shadow, no shape. Just the voice, disconnected from any visible source. Jen, if that's really you, tell me something only you would know. Rachel's voice was steadier now, though her hands shook as she gripped the headlamp. A pause. Then, I know about Marcus. Rachel's blood went cold. Marcus was her ex-boyfriend, a relationship that had ended badly 2 years ago. Only Jen knew the whole story. The details Rachel had never shared with anyone else. The way he'd gaslight her, making her doubt her own perceptions. The night she'd called Jen crying, and Jen had driven across the city to get her out of that apartment. I know what he did to you, the voice continued. And now there was something wrong with it. Something that made Rachel's skin crawl. The words were right, but the tone was shifting, becoming less human, more like an imitation of human speech. I know how he made you feel. Small, worthless, afraid. Stop. Rachel's hands found the canister of bear spray she kept by her sleeping bag. I know where you hide the scar on your wrist, the voice said. And now it was changing further, deepening, losing its resemblance to Jen entirely. I know what you think about when you can't sleep. I know your fears, Rachel. I know everything. The temperature inside the tent had dropped noticeably. Rachel could see frost forming on the inner walls of the tent, delicate crystals spreading in branching patterns. Her breath came out in white clouds. Something brushed against the tent wall from outside. Not a hand, something larger. The entire side of the tent deformed inward, as if something massive was leaning against it. The fabric strained but didn't tear. Let me in, Rachel. The voice was no longer Jen's. It was deeper, rougher, with an undertone that sounded like wind through hollow trees, like the creaking of old wood, like the sound dead leaves make when they skitter across frozen ground. Rachel scrambled backward in her sleeping bag, pressing herself against the opposite wall of the tent. The pressure on the fabric increased, pushing inward, the tent poles bending under the weight. Whatever was out there was large enough to collapse the entire structure. Then it stopped. The pressure released, and the tent sprang back to its normal shape. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Expectant. Predatory. Rachel. Her father's voice this time, gruff and concerned. Rachel, honey, are you okay? Your mother and I are worried about you out here alone. Her father had been dead for 5 years. Heart attack in his workshop. Quick and unexpected. She had been the one to find him, had held his hand as the paramedics worked, had watched the light leave his eyes. We miss you, sweetheart. Her mother's voice joined in, and Rachel felt tears burning hot tracks down her cold cheeks because her mother was alive, but she was in a care facility in Kingston, her mind lost to Alzheimer's, unable to remember Rachel's name most days. Why don't you come out of the tent? Come talk to us. The voices were so perfect. Every inflection, every familiar pattern of speech. It would be so easy to believe, to want to believe. But Rachel knew better. Something was using her memories, her grief, her love for the people she'd lost as a weapon against her. You're not real, she said through clenched teeth. You're not them. A sound like laughter, but not quite. Multiple voices overlapping, creating a discordant chorus. Then Marcus's voice, sharp and cutting the way it had been in their worst fights. You're pathetic, Rachel. Alone in the woods because you can't handle real human connection. Running away like you always do. She recognized the tactic. The cruelty designed to provoke a reaction, to make her angry enough to act without thinking. She wouldn't give it the satisfaction. Rachel pulled her satellite phone from her pack. No signal. The screen showed full bars when she'd checked at camp, but now there was nothing, just an error message she'd never seen before. She tried the GPS. Dead. The headlamp flickered, dimmed, nearly went out before strengthening again. Something was wrong with the batteries, with the electronics, or something was interfering with them. The voices continued outside, cycling through everyone she'd ever known. Friends, relatives, colleagues, old flames, some alive, some dead. All of them saying things designed to hurt, to frighten, to convince her to open the tent. Rachel forced herself to think rationally. She had food and water for a week. She could wait this out. Whatever was out there couldn't get into the tent as long as she didn't open it. She would stay put until morning, until the sun came up and burned away this nightmare. The hours crawled past, The voices never stopped, never grew tired. They spoke in an endless rotation, sometimes overlapping, creating a chaotic symphony of familiar voices saying terrible things. The tent fabric continued to frost over, and Rachel's breath came in white clouds despite the supposedly warm sleeping bag. Around what her watch claimed was 4 a.m., the voices stopped. The silence was somehow worse. Rachel strained to hear any sound from outside footsteps, breathing, anything that would tell her where the thing was. Nothing. Just the absolute stillness of a forest holding its breath. Then a new sound. Slow, heavy footsteps. Not human footsteps. Something with more than 2 legs, moving in a pattern that suggested a body too large, too wrong to be natural. The steps circled the tent, moving clockwise, each footfall creating a small tremor she could feel through the ground. Rachel watched the tent walls, tracking the movement by the shadows cast by her headlamp. The shadow appeared on the fabric, and her breath stopped completely. It was huge, impossibly huge. The shadow suggested something that stood at least 3 meters tall, with a body that was too narrow, too elongated, and from the head, or what should have been the head, great branching shapes extended upward. Antlers, she realized, massive antlers like those of a bull moose, but larger, more complex, with too many points. The thing completed its circuit of the tent and stopped directly in front of the door. Rachel could see its shadow clearly now, backlit by her headlamp. The antlers scraped against the trees above, making a sound like bone against wood. It stood there for a long moment. Rachel could hear breathing now, a slow, rattling sound like air moving through a damaged bellows. The smell that seeped through the tent fabric was overwhelming rot and damp earth, and something organic that reminded her of the deer carcass she'd once found bloating in the summer heat. "I know you're afraid," the thing said, and its voice was an amalgamation of all the voices it had used, layered on top of each other, creating a sound that was almost musical in its horror. "I can taste your fear. It's delicious. But I'm patient, Rachel Hayes. I can wait." The shadow shifted. An appendage, an arm, a leg, something reached out and pressed against the tent door. The zipper rattled but held. The thing pushed harder, and Rachel heard fabric beginning to tear, the stress creating small rips at the seam. She grabbed the bear spray, flipped off the safety. If it got through, she'd spray first and ask questions never. But the thing withdrew. The shadow receded, the footsteps moving away from the tent, back toward the lake. Rachel tracked its movement until she could no longer see or hear it, and then she waited. Muscles locked, bear spray ready, as the night slowly gave way to gray pre-dawn light. When the first rays of sun touched the tent, Rachel felt warmth return gradually to the air. The frost on the tent walls began to melt, running down in small rivulets. She waited another hour until the sun was fully up, and the forest had returned to its normal daytime sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind moving through the pines. Only then did she risk opening the tent. The clearing looked exactly as she'd left it. Fire ring undisturbed, bear line intact. Her canoe where she'd pulled it up onto the rocks. Everything normal except for the tracks. They started at the edge of the clearing and circled her tent multiple times before heading back toward the tree line. Not hoofprints, though they suggested something hooved. The impressions were too deep, too widely spaced. Whatever had made them was far heavier than any moose or deer, and the spacing between prints suggested a gait that was wrong, something that moved like a quadruped, but whose proportions didn't match any animal Rachel knew. She followed the tracks to the tree line. They continued into the forest, but after about 20 meters they simply stopped. Not at a rocky patch where they'd become untrackable, just stopped mid-stride, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist. Rachel returned to her tent, packed with shaking hands, loaded the canoe, and paddled away from that small, unnamed lake as fast as her arms could manage. She didn't stop until she was back at Cedar Lake, back where other people could be seen on the water, where cell phones worked and the voices of real humans carried across the water. She never went back to the interior, never took another solo trip, because she knew with absolute certainty that the thing in the forest was still there, still waiting, and the next time, it might not let her leave at all. Story 3. The Ice Road to Moosonee. Frank O'Connell checked his truck's load one final time before pulling out of the depot in Cochrane. 30 tons of supplies, food, medicine, construction materials destined for Moosonee and the communities along James Bay. The winter road would be open for maybe another 3 weeks before spring breakup made it impassable. And every run counted. The northern communities depended on these shipments to last them through the seasons when the ice road couldn't operate. The sun was setting as he guided the massive truck north on Highway 634, the last stretch of paved road before the winter route began. Frank had been running loads up here for 15 years, knew every curve and pothole, every section of ice that needed extra caution. The James Bay Winter Road was treacherous 300 kilometers of frozen muskeg and river crossings, but it paid well, and Frank needed the money. His CB radio crackled with the voices of other truckers making the run. Weather reports, ice conditions, gossip about who'd gotten stuck and who'd made record time. The camaraderie helped break the monotony and the isolation of these long hauls into the far north. By the time Frank transitioned from highway to the winter road proper, full darkness had fallen. His headlights carved tunnels of light through the falling snow. The forecast had called for light flurries, but this was developing into something heavier. Frank frowned, adjusting his speed slightly. Whiteout conditions were dangerous out here. No landmarks, no lights, just endless white in every direction. The GPS showed him on course, following the established route across frozen lakes and through sparse stands of black spruce. The truck's heater worked overtime, against the cold seeping through the doors. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -35, and the wind was picking up. An hour into the winter road section, the GPS flickered and died. Frank tapped the screen, tried rebooting it. Nothing. The device was completely dead, which shouldn't be possible. It was hardwired to the truck's electrical system and had a backup battery. He grabbed his backup GPS unit from the glove box. Also dead. His cell phone showed no bars, which was expected this far north, but it should still function as a GPS receiver. The screen was frozen, unresponsive. The CB radio still worked, crackling with static. Any units on this channel, this is Unit 12 northbound on the James Bay route. GPS is out. Repeat, GPS is down. Anyone else experiencing equipment failure? Static. Then a voice, distant and distorted. Unit 12, weather. Stay on marked route. Repeat that last, didn't copy clearly. More static. The voice was gone, lost in the electronic noise. Frank cursed under his breath but kept driving. The route was marked with reflective posts every 50 meters, tall enough to remain visible above the snowdrifts. As long as he could see the markers, he could navigate. The whiteout was worsening, though, the snow now falling so heavily that his headlights reflected back at him in a disorienting wall of white. He slowed further, leaning forward to peer through the windshield, searching for the next marker post. There, a flash of reflective orange in the headlights. He steered toward it, past it, looked for the next. This was going to be a long night. That's when he saw the figure. It stood directly in the middle of the ice road, maybe 50 meters ahead, caught in the full glare of his headlights. Frank's foot hit the brake instinctively, the truck beginning to slow on the ice. You didn't brake hard on these roads, any sudden movement could send 30 tons of truck and cargo into an uncontrollable slide. The figure didn't move. As Frank got closer, details resolved. A person wearing a heavy parka, hood up, facing the truck. A hitchhiker, maybe, or someone from one of the communities flagging down help. The truck slid to a complete stop about 10 meters from the figure. Frank set the brake, grabbed his flashlight, and climbed down from the cab. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath. The wind had picked up significantly, driving the snow horizontally, creating conditions that would make any rescue difficult. "Hey!" Frank shouted over the wind. "You need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Frank approached cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the snow. As he got closer, he saw details that made his steps falter. The parka was wrong. Not modern gear, but an older style, the kind manufactured in the 80s. The fabric was covered in frost, so thick it looked like the person had been standing here for hours. But that was impossible. No one could survive this cold for more than minutes without protection. "Hey buddy, are you okay?" Frank reached out to touch the figure's shoulder. The moment his gloved hand made contact, the figure's head turned. The hood fell back, revealing a face that had frozen solid. The skin was blue-white, lips black, eyes open but filmed over with ice. Frost covered the eyebrows and eyelashes. This was a corpse, frozen solid, somehow standing upright on the ice road. Frank jerked backward, his boot slipping on the ice. He caught himself, heart hammering, mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Dead people didn't stand up. Dead people didn't stay standing in the middle of ice roads during blizzards. The corpse's arm moved, raising slowly, pointing forward down the road. The frozen joints creaked audibly, even over the wind. Frank ran back to his truck, scrambled into the cab, slammed the door. His hands shook as he released the brake and put the truck in gear. He pulled around the figure, giving it a wide berth, not looking at it directly. In his side mirror, he saw it still standing there, arm outstretched, pointing into the storm. His CB radio crackled to life. "Turn around." A voice, male, flat and emotionless. "Turn around. Death ahead." "Who is this? Identify yourself." "Turn around." Frank grabbed the CB handset. "Listen, I've got a schedule to keep. I can't turn around because some joker is playing pranks on the radio." Silence. Then, "Not a prank, not alive. Turn around." The truck crested a small rise, and Frank saw another figure on the road ahead. This one was different, a woman in a parka, standing exactly like the first, arm raised and pointing forward. As he passed her, he got a clear look at her face through the headlights. Also frozen, also dead, also impossibly standing. The CB voice spoke again, but this time Frank recognized something about it. The flat, emotionless tone wasn't from poor radio quality. It was the voice of someone whose vocal cords had frozen solid. "Following the markers," the voice said. "We're showing you the way." Frank looked at the reflective marker posts that had been guiding him. In the headlights, he could see that the posts weren't posts at all. They were people, frozen people, standing at 50-meter intervals, marking a route that diverged from the actual ice road. He'd been following them for the last 20 minutes, led off course by corpses that stood like signposts in the snow. Frank spun the wheel, trying to turn the truck around, but the ice had no traction. The trailer began to slide, jackknifing slowly. He corrected, fighting to keep control, but the weight and momentum were against him. The truck slid sideways, tires unable to grip, moving inexorably toward the dark shape he could now see off to his right. Open water. A crack in the ice, or maybe a section that had never properly frozen. A lead of black water that steamed in the extreme cold. The truck was sliding directly toward it, and Frank had no way to stop the momentum. He grabbed for the door handle, preparing to bail out, but a hand cold even through his window pressed against the glass. The first frozen corpse stood beside his door, its face level with Frank's, looking in at him with those ice-filmed eyes. "We waited," the thing said, its voice buzzing through the glass like an insect trapped in amber. "Waited for someone to follow, so cold, so alone. Now you'll wait too." The truck's front wheels hit the edge of the ice. Frank felt the sickening lurch as the cab began to tip forward. Dark water rushed up to meet him, water so cold it would kill in seconds, would freeze him as solid as the things that had led him here. But Frank had been in enough bad situations to keep a clear head when it mattered. He kicked the door open. The frozen thing outside stumbled backward and threw himself out of the cab as it went over the edge. He hit the ice hard, rolled, scrambled away from the cracking sounds as the truck's weight broke through. The trailer was going under, dragged by the cab. 30 tons of truck and cargo sliding into the black water with a sound like thunder. Frank ran, his boots slipping on the ice, away from the crack that was spreading, away from the open water that would pull him down if he fell through. He made it maybe 20 meters before the ice beneath him simply gave way. Frank plunged into water so cold it felt like knives stabbing into every inch of his body. The shock stole his breath, his muscles seizing. He thrashed, trying to find the surface, but he was disoriented, the darkness absolute. His heavy winter clothing was pulling him down, waterlogged and impossible to remove with his freezing fingers. Something grabbed his jacket collar. He felt himself being pulled upward, hauled through the water with supernatural strength. His head broke the surface and he gasped, drawing in air that burned his lungs. Multiple hands dragged him onto solid ice. He lay there gasping, coughing up water, his body shaking violently as hypothermia began to set in. Through his blurred vision, he could see figures standing around him. The frozen dead, their faces expressionless, looking down at him with their ice-filmed eyes. "Get up," one said, the woman in the parka. "Keep moving or you'll freeze." Frank's mind couldn't process it. They'd led him to the open water, caused his crash, and now they were saving him. "Get up," another voice, more insistent. "Follow the real markers, before the cold takes you." With strength he didn't know he had, Frank pushed himself to his feet. His clothes were already freezing to his body, becoming stiff and rigid. He could feel his eyelashes starting to frost over. If he stayed still, he would become one of them, another frozen corpse, standing on the ice road, waiting for the next victim. The figures formed a line, pointing in a different direction than they had before. Through the blizzard, Frank could see a faint light in the distance. Red light, flashing. An emergency beacon, maybe, or another truck's taillights. He stumbled in that direction, each step agony, his body screaming for him to stop and rest. But rest meant death, meant freezing, meant standing here forever in the storm. So he kept moving, following the new direction the frozen dead indicated. The red light grew closer. Not a truck's taillights, but a reflective marker post, a real one, marking the actual ice road. Frank collapsed against it, using it for support as he forced himself to keep walking. One post, then another, following the real route now, away from the frozen sentinels and their deathly guidance. He walked for an eternity, time losing meaning in the white hell of the blizzard. His body moved on autopilot, one foot in front of the other, following the posts when he could see them, following his instinct when the whiteout was too complete. Then headlights appeared through the snow. A truck, coming from the opposite direction, slowing as it approached. Frank stumbled toward it, waving his arms. The truck stopped, and a driver climbed out, a woman, her face concerned behind the wrap of her scarf. "Jesus Christ, what happened to you?" She helped him toward the truck. "Your lips are blue. We need to get you warm right now." In the heated cab, Wrapped in emergency blankets with the heater blasting, Frank tried to explain. The GPS dying, the figures on the ice, the open water. How they'd let him off the road but then saved him, pointed him back to safety. The woman listened, her expression carefully neutral. "You went through the ice," she said finally. "You're hypothermic. What saw. Sometimes the cold does things to your mind." But Frank knew what he'd seen, knew it was real. And when they passed a marker post and he looked out into the storm, he saw them, the frozen dead, standing at intervals, watching as he drove past in the warmth and safety of the rescue truck. They'd saved him, led him astray, nearly killed him, but ultimately pointed him towards survival. Because they were lonely, he realized. Lonely and frozen and wanting company. They'd been people once, truckers maybe, or travelers who'd made some fatal mistake on this treacherous road. And now they stood eternal vigil, sometimes guiding people to their doom, sometimes pointing them toward salvation, depending on some unknowable whim. Frank never drove the ice roads again, but on cold winter nights, when the wind howled and the temperature dropped low enough to freeze breath into crystal, he thought about them. The frozen dead, standing in the storm, waiting for the next traveler to either guide or claim, alone in the endless white. Story 4. The Niagara Undertow. Marcus Sterling's boots echoed on the concrete floor of the Sir Adam Beck generating station as he made his rounds. The night shift maintenance inspection was routine: check the turbines, monitor the intake systems, ensure the massive flow of Niagara River water was being converted into electricity without issue. The roar of the falls was omnipresent here, a constant thunder that vibrated through the building's bones. Most people thought of Niagara Falls as a tourist destination, a honeymoon spot, a natural wonder to be photographed and admired. Marcus knew it differently. He saw the engineering marvel that harnessed its power, the vast tunnels that diverted millions of gallons per minute, the machinery that turned falling water into the electricity that powered millions of homes. He also knew its dangers. The currents were vicious, the undertow legendary. Every year, people went into the water and never came out, their bodies pulled under by forces that seemed almost malicious in their strength. Some were thrill seekers, some suicides, some just unlucky. The river didn't discriminate. It was 2:30 in the morning when Marcus reached the intake grate inspection station. This was the least favorite part of his rounds, a narrow walkway that overlooked the massive grates where water from the river entered the intake tunnels. The spray was constant here, and even with the railings, there was something unsettling about standing above that much water, moving with that much force. He ran his flashlight beam over the grates, checking for debris. Sometimes logs would get caught, or trash, or rarely, thankfully, bodies. The grates were designed to catch large objects before they could damage the turbines, which meant Marcus had seen things he wished he could forget. Tonight, something was caught in the southeast section. Something small and angular. Not a log. Marcus leaned over the railing, trying to get a better angle with his flashlight. The object was wedged between the grate bars, being buffeted by the incredible water pressure but not breaking free. A camera. A waterproof camera, the kind divers used, bright yellow plastic housing intact. Marcus shouldn't have cared. It was just trash, essentially. Something that would get flushed through eventually or get caught in the next debris collection. But there was something about it that nagged at him. Waterproof cameras often still had photos on them. Sometimes those photos were important last images of people who didn't make it out of the water. He filed a maintenance note and continued his rounds. But the camera stuck in his mind through the rest of the shift, through his drive home as dawn broke over the city, through the daylight hours when he should have been sleeping. When he returned for his next shift that evening, Marcus made a decision. He'd retrieve the camera, develop whatever was on it, see if it needed to be turned over to the authorities. It was probably nothing, probably just tourist shots and selfies. But it felt like the right thing to do. Getting to the grate required safety protocols and 2 other crew members as spotters. Marcus clipped into the safety line and descended the maintenance ladder, spray soaking through his rain gear immediately. The roar of the water was deafening this close, making communication impossible except through hand signals. The camera was still wedged in the grate, exactly where he'd seen it. Marcus reached through the bars, his arm submerged to the shoulder in the churning water, and worked the camera free. The current tried to rip it from his grasp, but he held on, pulled it back through, and signaled for the crew to haul him up. Back in the control room, dripping and shivering despite the heated building, Marcus examined his find. The camera housing was intact, no visible cracks. The seal looked good. There might actually be recoverable data inside. He took it home after his shift, dried it thoroughly, and cracked open the housing. The camera itself was older, a model from maybe 5 years ago, but it appeared functional. The battery was dead, but when he charged it and powered it on, the screen lit up. 63 photos stored in memory. Marcus made himself a coffee and settled in to review them. The first dozen were exactly what he expected. Tourists at the falls, a family posing with the rainbow mist in the background, a couple kissing on the observation deck, standard vacation shots. He clicked through them quickly. Then the photos changed. The photographer had gone somewhere the tourists didn't go. The images showed industrial areas around the generating stations, chain link fences and warning signs. Then tunnels, service tunnels, by the look of them, the kind that maintenance workers like Marcus used, but that were supposed to be secured against public access. The photographer had been somewhere they shouldn't have been. Marcus frowned, clicking, to the next image. Water. A photo taken at water level, looking across a dark expanse of river. The angle was wrong, though too low, like the photographer had been lying on their stomach or was partially submerged. The image was blurred by spray but showed the glow of the city lights reflecting on the water's surface. Next image. Underwater. The photographer had gone under, the camera capturing the murky darkness of the river, particles and sediment caught in the flash like snow. Nothing else visible except darkness and current. Marcus should have stopped there. Should have recognized that these were probably images from someone who had drowned. Someone whose body might still be waiting to be recovered. But he kept clicking. The next photo showed the bottom of the river. Rocky, silty, the flash illuminating maybe 2 meters of visibility. In the corner of the frame, something pale and round. A rock, maybe. Or Marcus leaned closer to his computer screen. Not a rock. A face. Human-sized, human-shaped, but wrong. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but distorted, stretched. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were too large, bulging slightly. Just a trick of the light, Marcus told himself. Decomposition and water pressure could do strange things to bodies. But his hands were shaking slightly as he clicked to the next image. More faces. Dozens of them, crowded together on the river bottom, all with that same pale, stretched appearance. They were looking up toward the surface, toward the camera, their mouths open in what might have been screams, or might have been something else entirely. And they had gills. Marcus could see them clearly in the next photo slits in the necks, 3 on each side, opening and closing. Not drowning victims, not human bodies at all, but something else. Something that lived down there in the darkness and pressure of the Niagara Undertow. The next several photos showed more of the creatures. Some were swimming, if swimming was the right word, their movements captured in blur that suggested speed and predatory grace. Others were still, watching the camera with those bulging eyes. The photographer had gotten close, remarkably close, as if drawn down to them or pulled. Then the photos showed the city, but not the city from above. These were taken from below the water's surface, looking up through the current at the lights of Niagara Falls at night. Tourists walking along the railings, people posing for photos, all of them seen from below, from the river, the way prey might look to a predator. Marcus's mouth went dry. The creatures weren't just living in the river, they were watching, waiting, choosing. The photos continued. Now they showed the intake tunnels, the same ones Marcus inspected on his shifts. The massive grates seen from the water side, where the current compressed everything towards the openings. And clustered against the grates, holding on despite the incredible force of the water, were more of the pale creatures. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds, extending back into the darkness where the camera flash couldn't reach. They were everywhere. In every intake, every tunnel, every submerged structure. A city beneath the city, a civilization thriving in the one place humans couldn't easily go, the deadly currents of Niagara River. The final photos showed the surface again. But these were different. These were taken from directly below people. Marcus could see the underside of the observation platforms, the shapes of tourists leaning over railings to get better views. And in each photo, one or more of the pale creatures could be seen swimming up from the depths, approaching. The very last photo made Marcus drop his coffee mug. It showed Marcus himself. Not from yesterday or last week, but from tonight. He recognized his rain gear, his safety harness, the angle of him reaching through the grate bars. The photo had been taken from below, looking up through the grate, capturing the exact moment he'd retrieved the camera. Which meant the camera had been placed there deliberately, had been put there for him to find, loaded with these images as a message or a warning or a... His phone rang, making him jump. An unknown number. Marcus answered it automatically, his mind still reeling. Hello? Breathing. Wet, rasping breathing. Then a voice, garbled and strange, like someone speaking underwater. You've seen us now. Who is this? We've always been here, in the river, in the falls, in the deep places where the water goes. The voice paused, and Marcus heard what sounded like water moving, waves lapping. We've been here since before your machines, since before your city. We were here when this was just stone and falling water. What do you want? The same thing you want. To survive. To thrive. You take our water for your power. We take what the river offers us. Another pause. The ones who fall. The ones who jump. The ones who lean too far. The river gives them to us. Marcus thought about all the disappearances over the years. The bodies never found. The strange undertow that seemed to pull more effectively than physics should allow. And now you know, the voice continued. You've seen us. You know we're here. The question is what you'll do with that knowledge. I should report this. Tell people. A sound like laughter, bubbling and wet. Tell them what? That there are creatures in the river? That the falls hide something impossible? Show them the photos. See who believes you. See who doesn't think you've lost your mind. Marcus looked at the computer screen, at the image of himself reaching through the grate. Why show me at all? Why let me see? Because we want you to know. Want you to understand that we're here, we're watching, and we're not going anywhere. The river is ours, has always been ours. Your machines, your tourists, your city built on our shores, these are temporary. We are eternal. The line went dead. Marcus sat in silence, looking at the photos. He transferred them to a flash drive, then to 3 separate drives, backing up the evidence. But even as he did, he wondered what the point was. The voice on the phone was right, who would believe him? The photos could be faked. The whole thing could be a hoax, a prank by a co-worker with too much time and skill with Photoshop. But Marcus knew better. He'd felt something when he reached through the grate, something more than just the current. A presence in the water, watching him. He'd seen the photo of himself, taken from below at the exact moment he'd been there. This was real. He went back to work the next night because what else could he do? The falls still needed their power harnessed. The turbines still needed monitoring. But he approached the intake grates differently now, looked at the dark water with new understanding. They were down there, always had been. Pale things with gills and bulging eyes, adapted to survive in currents that would destroy a human in seconds. They watched the tourists and waited for the river to give them what it had always given them, the unwary, the unlucky, the foolish. And Marcus understood that he was supposed to know this, was supposed to carry the knowledge, to see the missing persons reports and the frantic searches and know the truth. They wanted someone to understand what they were, even if that someone could never speak about it without being called insane. He was the witness, the one who knew. And every night when he made his rounds, checking the grates and monitoring the intake, he felt them watching him from below, from the places where the water ran deepest and fastest, waiting patiently for the day when he or someone else might lean just a little too far, slip just a bit too close, and learn firsthand what it meant to be claimed by the Niagara Undertow. Story 5. The Reflection in Muskoka. Emma Fitzgerald had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cottage rental in Muskoka promised luxury and isolation floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a pristine lake, modern amenities mixed with rustic charm, and most importantly, absolute solitude. No roommates, no co-workers, no expectations. Just Emma, and 3 days of peace to decompress from a brutal year of corporate deadlines and office politics. The drive from Toronto took 3 hours, winding through increasingly rural roads until the GPS directed her down a private lane, marked only by a discreet wooden sign. The cottage appeared through the trees like something from an architecture magazine, all glass and natural wood, cantilevered over the water, designed to blur the line between interior and exterior space. Emma parked, grabbed her bags, and found the key exactly where the rental agency had indicated. The interior was even more impressive than the photos. The main living space was dominated by those massive windows, offering an uninterrupted view across the lake to the far shore, where trees grew dense and dark. The water was mirror smooth in the late afternoon light, reflecting the sky and shoreline with perfect clarity. She spent the first hour unpacking, familiarizing herself with the space, opening a bottle of wine she'd brought from the city. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that doubled in the lake's reflection. Emma stood at the windows with her wine glass, feeling the tension of the city beginning to drain away. As darkness fell, the windows transformed. The cottage's interior lights turned the glass into black mirrors, reflecting the interior space back at Emma instead of showing the lake beyond. She closed some curtains in the bedroom and bathroom, but left the main living area open. There was something magical about being surrounded by darkness, the cottage a small island of light in the wilderness. She made dinner, showered in the ensuite bathroom with its glass walls and rainfall shower head, and finally settled onto the modern sofa with her laptop to watch a movie before bed. The reflection of herself in the darkened windows was constant, a duplicate Emma moving in sync with her real movements, a shadow self that lived in the glass. Around 11, she decided to call it a night. She brushed her teeth at the bathroom sink, which faced a glass wall that currently showed nothing but her own reflection against the darkness outside. The bathroom light was harsh and clinical, making her reflection sharp and clear. Emma bent to spit out the toothpaste, then reached for her toothbrush to rinse it. When she straightened up and looked back at her reflection, it was still bent over the sink. She froze, toothbrush in hand, watching the reflection. It straightened slowly, perhaps a half-second behind her own movement, and smiled. Not Emma's smile, she knew her own smile. This was wider, showing more teeth, with an expression that was wrong somehow. Too eager, too hungry. Emma stepped back from the sink. Her reflection mimicked the movement perfectly now, returning to exact synchronization. Had she imagined the delay? Was it a trick of the light, or exhaustion playing with her perception? She waved her hand. The reflection waved back, perfectly timed. Shaking her head at her own paranoia, Emma rinsed her mouth and headed for bed. But as she passed the main windows in the living area, she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection watching her from the glass wasn't quite moving the same way she was. The timing was off by fractions of a second, as if it was anticipating her movements rather than mirroring them. In bed with the curtains drawn, Emma tried to sleep. The cottage was absolutely silent, except for the small sounds of the building itself, wood creaking as temperatures dropped, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind against the windows. She drifted off eventually, exhausted from the drive and the wine. A sound woke her, a thump, like something striking glass. Emma sat up in darkness, heart pounding. The sound had come from the main living area. She grabbed her phone for light and crept to the bedroom door. The living area was dark, except for the ambient glow from her phone screen. The massive windows showed nothing but blackness and her own faint reflection. Emma swept the phone light across the space, looking for what might have made the sound. Nothing appeared out of place. Then the thump came again, definitely from the windows, like a hand slapping against the glass from outside. Emma approached slowly, her phone light raised. The glass reflected the light back at her, making it hard to see anything beyond. She cupped her hands around her face and pressed close to the window, trying to see out into the darkness of the lake. A face pressed back from the other side, centimeters from hers. Emma screamed and fell backward, her phone skittering across the floor. In the brief illumination before the screen went dark, she saw the face clearly. It was her face, her exact face, but pale and dripping wet, as if it had been submerged in the lake. And it was smiling that too wide smile, the one she'd seen in the bathroom mirror. The lights. Emma scrambled for the wall switch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely flip it up. The overhead lights blazed to life, flooding the cottage with illumination. The windows showed only her reflection now, multiple versions of herself standing in the lit interior, looking panicked and disheveled. Nothing outside, no face, no wet duplicate pressing against the glass. Emma stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, trying to rationalize what she'd seen. A nightmare, maybe. She'd been asleep, then woke suddenly. It could have been sleep paralysis or hypnagogic hallucination. Her mind playing tricks in the liminal space between sleep and waking. She picked up her phone, checked the time. 2:30 in the morning. The cottage rental agency's emergency number was in her contacts. But what would she even say? That she'd seen her own reflection behaving strangely? That she'd frightened herself awake in the middle of the night? Emma made tea, forcing herself to go through the calming ritual. Boil water, steep the bag, add honey. Normal actions, real actions. The reflection in the windows mimicked her perfectly, and she watched it carefully, looking for any hint of independence or delay. Nothing. Just a normal reflection behaving the way reflections should. She was being ridiculous, scaring herself for no reason. This was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, not a horror movie. But she kept the lights on, couldn't bring herself to turn them off and face those dark windows again. Dawn came slowly, the sky gradually lightening beyond the windows. As the exterior became visible, the reflections faded, replaced by the actual view of the lake and forest. In daylight, everything seemed less threatening. Emma opened the curtains she'd closed, let morning light flood the space. She spent the day determinedly enjoying herself. Took her coffee outside to the deck, went for a long walk along the shoreline, read her book in the sun. The night's scare seemed distant and foolish in the bright autumn day. But as evening approached, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Emma felt the anxiety returning. Soon it would be dark. Soon the windows would become mirrors again. Soon she'd be surrounded by reflections in the glass. She considered leaving. Could pack up right now, drive back to Toronto, forfeit the rest of the rental. But that seemed like an overreaction, like letting irrational fear win. Instead, she closed all the curtains before dark, covering every window and glass door. The cottage felt smaller, closed in, but at least she wouldn't have to watch her reflection all night. Emma made dinner, poured more wine than was probably wise, tried to distract herself with television. But she couldn't focus. Kept thinking about the face in the window, wet and smiling. Kept thinking about the reflection in the bathroom that had moved wrong. Around 10, she forced herself to take a shower. The bathroom's glass walls were covered with curtains now, but she still felt exposed. She kept the shower quick, efficient, and when she stepped out to dry off, she avoided looking directly at any reflective surface. At the sink, brushing her teeth, Emma kept her eyes down, focusing on her task. But eventually she had to look up, had to see herself in the mirror above the sink. Her reflection was waiting for her. And it wasn't moving right. When Emma raised her hand to her mouth with the toothbrush, the reflection raised its hand a fraction of a second too early. When Emma lowered it, the reflection held the gesture too long. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't watching carefully, but undeniable. Emma put the toothbrush down slowly. Her reflection did the same, but the timing was wrong. She raised both hands, placed them on the sides of the sink. Her reflection mirrored the pose, but Emma could see it, the slight delay, the anticipation, the independence. "What are you?" she whispered. Her reflection's mouth moved, but not in sync with her words. It was speaking something else, words Emma couldn't hear but could see being formed. Then it smiled again, that terrible, too wide smile, and began to bang on the mirror from the inside. The sound was shockingly loud, like fists hammering against glass. The mirror shook in its frame but didn't break. Emma stumbled backward out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut. But she could hear the pounding continuing, rhythmic and insistent. Then it stopped. Silence. Emma stood in the hallway, her heart racing. This was insane. Impossible. Reflections didn't move independently, didn't bang on mirrors, didn't exist except as bounced light. A voice came from behind the bathroom door, muffled but audible. Her voice, but with something off about it, like an imitation that wasn't quite accurate. "Let me out, Emma. I've been here so long, in the cold and the dark. Let me out and I'll let you rest. We can trade. You can have the cold and the dark, and I'll have your warm life." "You're not real." Emma's voice shook. "I'm as real as you are. More real, maybe. I've been here forever, waiting, trapped in the reflections, in the water, in the glass. Every window over the lake is a door. Every reflection is a cage. And you're right here, so close. I can feel your warmth. I want it. I want your life." The bathroom door began to rattle in its frame. Not from wind or building settlement, but from something on the other side pushing against it. The wood creaked, the hinges groaning. Emma ran, grabbed her car keys and phone, didn't bother with shoes or a jacket. She threw open the cottage's front door and sprinted for her car, her bare feet slapping against the wooden deck and then the gravel drive. Behind her, she heard glass breaking, a huge, sustained crash like every window in the cottage shattering at once. Emma risked a glance back as she reached her car. The cottage windows were intact, not broken, but pressed against them from the inside were dozens of figures, all of them her, or versions of her, pale and wet, wearing the same clothes she was wearing, but wrong somehow, like copies made by someone who was working from memory rather than seeing the original. They were all smiling, all raising their hands and pressing them against the glass, leaving palm prints that dripped with lake water. Emma fumbled with her car keys, dropping them, snatching them up again. She got the door open, threw herself inside, locked the doors. The engine started on the second try, and she reversed down the long driveway without headlights, too terrified to take the time to turn around properly. At the road, she finally flipped on the lights and drove. Drove fast, too fast for the narrow rural roads, but not stopping until she hit the highway. Even then, she kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those pale copies in her back seat, dripping and smiling. She drove straight back to Toronto, arriving as dawn was breaking. In her apartment, with all the curtains drawn and no reflective surfaces visible, Emma finally allowed herself to break down. She never went back to Muskoka, never tried to get a refund from the rental agency, never filed a complaint or left a review. What would she say? That her reflection had tried to trade places with her? That something in the lake had been wearing her face? But she couldn't escape reflections. They were everywhere: windows, mirrors, phone screens, puddles. And sometimes, when Emma caught her reflection in an unguarded moment, she saw it. That slight delay, that wrong smile, the suggestion that what looked back at her from the glass wasn't quite her, but something else, something that had almost succeeded in trading places, and was still waiting for another chance. The thing in the reflection was patient. It had waited in that lake for years, maybe decades, watching cottage renters come and go, waiting for someone vulnerable enough, isolated enough, to make the trade. It could wait a little longer, because every window was a door, every reflection was a prison. And sooner or later, Emma would look into the wrong mirror at the wrong time, and the thing wearing her face would finally step through and claim the warm life it had been promised. Story 6. The 50th floor of the TD Tower. Julian Banks rubbed his eyes and reached for the cold coffee that had been sitting on his desk for the past 3 hours. The merger documents filled his computer screens, endless pages of legal text that needed to be reviewed before the morning deadline. Around him, the 50th floor of the TD Tower was silent and empty, the other lawyers and staff having left hours ago. Julian didn't mind working late. Preferred it, actually. The office was quiet at night. No distractions, no meetings pulling him away from deep work. And the view from 50 floors up was spectacular, especially at night when the city lights transformed Toronto into a galaxy spread across the landscape. He stood to stretch, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the corner office he was borrowing for the night. Lake Ontario was a black expanse beyond the lit towers of downtown. The CN Tower stood to the west, its lights tracing the iconic needle shape against the sky. Below, the streets were quiet, traffic minimal at this hour. Julian checked his watch. 2:15 a.m. He'd be here until at least 4, maybe 5 if the documents yielded any surprises. He returned to his desk, pulled up the next section of the merger agreement, and lost himself in the legal language. 20 minutes later, he noticed the fog. It appeared suddenly, Or maybe he'd just been too focused on his work to see it developing. But now, looking up from his screens, Julian saw thick fog pressing against the windows. Not the thin mist that sometimes came off the lake, but dense, gray-white fog that completely obscured the city below. The other towers, the streets, the lake, all of it had vanished into the murk. Julian stood and approached the windows. He'd never seen fog this thick in Toronto. It looked almost solid, like something you could reach out and touch. The building lights reflected back from it, creating a strange glow that made the fog seem to pulse and shift. As he watched, something dark moved within the fog. Just a shadow, undefined, there and gone before he could focus on it. Probably just a denser patch moving in the wind, he reasoned. Though there didn't seem to be any wind, the fog was nearly static, just a slow roll like water. He returned to his desk, trying to shake the uneasy feeling the fog had brought. It was just weather. Unusual, maybe, but nothing to be concerned about. He had work to complete, and obsessing about atmospheric conditions wasn't productive. The thump made him jump, his hand knocking over the coffee cup. The sound had come from the windows, something hitting the glass hard enough to create a noise that echoed through the empty office. Julian's heart raced as he stood slowly. The windows were 50 floors up. Birds didn't fly this high at night. There shouldn't be anything that could impact the glass. He approached the windows cautiously, trying to see what had hit. The fog pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in, swirling slowly. No sign of a bird or debris. Nothing except there. A mark on the glass. Julian moved closer, frowning. It looked like a handprint. Palm and 5 fingers, larger than human-sized, pressed against the window from the outside. But that was impossible. There was nothing outside these windows except a 50-floor drop to the street below. The handprint started to slide down the glass, as if the hand was slipping. Julian pressed his face close to the window, trying to see what was making the mark. The fog obscured everything beyond about a meter from the glass. He could see nothing except the swirling gray and the handprint that was now near the bottom of the window panel. Then another thump, higher up. Julian looked up and saw another handprint appearing on the glass above him. This one was enormous, the fingers easily a meter long each, the palm twice the size of Julian's entire torso. It pressed against the window with enough force to make the glass creak audibly. Something was climbing the building. Something massive was using the fog as cover, pulling itself up the tower's exterior, and it had just reached Julian's floor. He stepped back from the windows, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The handprint began to move, dragging upward, and Julian realized with horror that it was gaining purchase. Whatever was out there was climbing higher, its weight and grip causing the entire window frame to flex slightly. More thumps. More handprints appearing on different window panels around the perimeter of the floor. Julian turned in a slow circle, watching as prints materialized from the fog. All of them enormous, all of them suggesting something far larger than should be able to exist, let alone climb the side of a skyscraper. The building swayed. Just slightly, but Julian felt it through his feet, a motion that wasn't caused by wind. Something heavy was on the exterior, and its movements were affecting the tower's stability. Julian grabbed his phone, dialed building security. The line rang 3 times before connecting. "Security, this is Wayne. This is Julian Banks on the 50th floor. There's something outside the building, something climbing it." A pause. "Sir, are you saying you see someone on the exterior?" "Not someone, something. I can see handprints on the windows, massive handprints, and the building is moving." Another pause, longer this time. Julian could hear keyboard typing in the background. "Sir, I'm not showing any alerts from the exterior motion sensors. Everything reads normal. Are you feeling all right? Have you been working long hours? I'm not imagining this. Julian's voice rose. Come up here and see for yourself. I'll send someone up to check on you, sir. Please stay where you are. The line went dead. Julian looked back at the windows. The handprints were everywhere now, covering the glass in overlapping patterns. And they were wet, he realized. Each print left moisture on the glass that trickled down in slow rivulets. A face appeared in the fog. Julian's breath caught. The face was easily 3 meters across, pressed against the windows like someone looking into a fishbowl. The features were vaguely human. 2 eyes, nose, mouth, but the proportions were all wrong. The eyes were too far apart, too large, with pupils that were vertical slits like a cat's. The skin was pale, almost translucent, showing dark veins beneath. And there were too many fingers framing the face, pressing against the glass on either side. The mouth opened. Julian saw teeth, rows of them, sharp and irregular. And then it spoke, the sound somehow carrying through the thick glass, vibrating through the building's structure. I see you, little thing, alone in your bright box, alone and so far from the ground. Julian ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted for the stairwell. Behind him, the windows groaned under increasing pressure. The face tracked his movement, the massive head turning, those slit eyes following him across the office. He hit the stairwell door at full speed, threw it open, and plunged into the concrete emergency stairs, 50 floors to the ground. He started down, taking the stairs 3 at a time, one hand on the railing to keep from falling. Behind him, above him, he heard a sound like thunder. Glass breaking, massive amounts of glass shattering. And then something else, a wet, sliding sound, like something enormous pulling itself through an opening far too small for it. Julian didn't look back. Couldn't look back. He just ran, floor after floor, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. 49th floor, 48th. The numbers painted on the wall blurred past. The stairwell lights began to flicker. Not the steady fluorescence they should be, but guttering like candles in a wind. And the temperature was dropping, fast enough that Julian could see his breath. Something was in the stairwell with him. He could hear it moving above, that same wet sliding sound, but also footsteps. Too many footsteps, irregular, like something with more than 2 legs trying to navigate stairs designed for humans. 45th floor, 40th. Julian's pace was slowing, exhaustion and terror taking their toll. His phone rang in his pocket, the security guard probably, but he didn't dare stop to answer it. 35th floor. He risked a glance up the central shaft of the stairwell, looking toward the floors above. A hand was descending toward him, reaching down through the center of the spiral stairs. But it wasn't coming from directly overhead, it was coming at an angle, as if the thing above was defying gravity, clinging to the walls or ceiling. The hand was pale and wet, fingers easily 2 meters long each, and they were grasping, searching, feeling along the railings and walls. Julian pressed himself against the outer wall and kept descending. 30th floor, 25th. The hand followed, always about 2 floors above him, moving with that impossible flexibility, bending around corners that should have been physically limiting. 20th floor, 15th. Julian's vision was tunneling, black spots appearing at the edges. He was going into shock, or having a panic attack, or both. But he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The hand was faster. It dropped suddenly, bypassing several floors at once, and Julian felt fingers brush the back of his neck. Cold, wet, with a texture like raw meat. He screamed and lunged forward, missed a step, tumbled down half a flight of stairs before catching himself on the railing. 10th floor. 5th. The ground level was so close, just a few more. The lobby doors appeared ahead, solid and real and offering escape. Julian crashed through them, stumbling into the bright lights and polished marble of the tower's main entrance. Security guards were there, 2 of them, moving toward him with concerned expressions. "Sir, are you okay? We got your call." "Something's in the building," Julian gasped. "In the stairwell. It came through the windows on I-50. The guards exchanged glances. One spoke into his radio. "This is Wayne at main entrance. We have a situation, possible mental health crisis. Send medical." "No, I'm not crazy. Check the cameras. Check the 50th floor." The guard Wayne pulled up something on a tablet. "Sir, I'm looking at the 50th floor feed right now. Everything's fine. Windows are intact. No signs of entry or damage." "That's impossible. I saw it. I saw the handprints, saw the thing's face." "Sir, you've clearly been under a lot of stress, working very late hours. Sometimes the mind can play tricks." A scream cut him off. One of the cleaning staff, an older woman with a cart, was staring up at the tower's interior atrium. She pointed with a shaking hand, unable to form words. Julian and the guards turned to look up. Something vast was descending from the upper floors. It moved like water flowing downward, but it had mass and substance. Pale flesh folding over itself, multiple limbs extending and retracting, pulling it down the interior of the tower. The thing was enormous, filling the entire atrium space, its body, if body was the right word, impossible to fully comprehend. Too many joints, too many angles, proportions that hurt to look at, and it was coming down fast. "Evacuate," Wayne shouted into his radio. "All personnel evacuate now, all floors." But Julian was already running again, out through the tower's main doors and into the street. Behind him he heard glass shattering, metal groaning, and a sound like wet canvas tearing. He ran 3 blocks before stopping, bending over to catch his breath. When he looked back at the TD Tower, it stood exactly as it always had. Lit windows, normal exterior, no fog, no damage, no sign of anything wrong. But Julian knew better. Knew that something had climbed up from the lake, using the fog as cover. Something that lived in the deep water, that had decided to explore the towers humans built. That was curious about the tiny creatures that worked in bright boxes so far above the ground. The next morning, the news reported unusual fog conditions around downtown Toronto. Several people called in sick from the TD Tower, reporting nightmares and anxiety. The cleaning staff member who'd screamed had quit, refusing to explain why. And Julian Banks tendered his resignation, effective immediately. He never worked in a high-rise again. Took a job in a single-story suburban office, somewhere with solid walls and windows that looked out on ground level. Because he knew the truth that Toronto's towers stood on the shore of a deep lake, and sometimes things from that lake decided to climb, to see what all the lights and activity were about. And those things were patient. They could wait in the fog, wait in the water, wait for another foggy night when someone would be alone and 50 floors up, working late with the city spread below them like stars. The view was spectacular. But the view looked back. Story 7. The Corn Maze at Tower. Stratford Wyatt Sullivan pulled his truck into the empty parking lot of Mercer Farm, the headlights sweeping across the remnants of the Halloween season. It was November 8th, well past the time when the last tourists had walked through the elaborate corn maze, screamed at the jump scare actors, and bought overpriced pumpkins from the farm stand. Now it was just cleanup time, the unglamorous aftermath that nobody wanted to do, but somebody had to. That somebody was Wyatt. He'd worked for the Mercers for 3 seasons, knew the farm inside and out, and didn't mind the isolation of post-season work. The pay was decent, and the work was straightforward. dismantle the maze, clear the paths, prepare the field for winter plowing. He grabbed his work gloves and the farm radio, clipping it to his belt. The Mercers were off at some farming conference in Guelph, trusting Wyatt to handle the cleanup. The forecast called for cold but clear weather, perfect for outdoor work that involved a lot of physical activity. The corn maze sprawled across 5 acres, its paths winding through stalks that had been left deliberately tall for the Halloween effect. In its heyday, the maze had been impressive 12-foot walls of dry corn, creating corridors and dead ends, themed sections with horror decorations, scarecrows positioned at key junctions to startle visitors. Now, in early November, the stalks were brown and brittle, the decorations faded and forlorn. The whole thing had a melancholy feel, like a party long after the guests had left. Wyatt started at the outer edge, using a machete to cut down stalks and drag them to collection points where they'd eventually be baled for cattle feed. The work was rhythmic and meditative. Cut, drag, cut, drag. The November sun was weak but adequate, the sky clear and blue. By midday, he'd made good progress on the outer perimeter. He broke for lunch, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a sandwich and coffee from his thermos. From this vantage point, he could see into the heart of the maze, where the stalks still stood tall and dense. That would be tomorrow's work, he figured. Start from the outside and work inward, like peeling an onion. After lunch, Wyatt decided to scout the interior paths before continuing with the demolition. He wanted to check on the structural decorations. Some of the wooden frames and platforms would need to be dismantled carefully and saved for next year. Waste not, want not, as Old Man Mercer always said. He entered the maze through the main entrance, following the path that had once guided eager thrill-seekers. The corn walls rose on either side, blocking the view of anything beyond. During the Halloween season, this had been atmospheric and spooky. Now, in the stark November daylight, it just felt claustrophobic. The first scarecrow stood at the initial junction, where the path split into 3 options. Wyatt remembered positioning it himself, a classic design with a burlap sack head, button eyes, and stitched smile. It wore a flannel shirt and jeans, stuffed with straw, arms spread wide on a crossbeam. Wyatt paused, frowning. The scarecrow's head was turned to the left. He distinctly remembered positioning it to face forward, toward approaching visitors for maximum impact. Could someone have been here after the closure? Kids messing around, maybe, though the farm was gated and the roads private. He adjusted the scarecrow's head, turning it back to face forward, and continued into the maze. The paths twisted and turned, deliberately designed to confuse. Even having helped construct it, Wyatt needed to pay attention to avoid getting turned around. The maze had been complex enough that some visitors had needed assistance finding their way out during operating hours. The second scarecrow was in the western section, positioned in a dead end to surprise visitors who'd taken the wrong turn. This one wore overalls and a battered hat, its arms hanging at its sides rather than outstretched. Wyatt approached it, checking the structural frame for damage or wear. The scarecrow's hands were dirty. Really dirty, the gloves caked with something dark that looked like soil. But these scarecrows had been handled with clean gloves when set up, and they'd been standing in the same spots for weeks. There was no reason for fresh dirt on the hands. Wyatt touched the glove carefully. The soil was damp and smelled of earth, as if the scarecrow had been digging. Which was absurd. Scarecrows didn't move, didn't dig. Someone must have been here, must have messed with the decorations. Vandals, probably, though what satisfaction they'd get from putting dirt on scarecrow gloves was beyond him. He continued deeper into the maze, finding the center section where the grand finale had been staged, a mock graveyard with foam tombstones, a fog machine, and 4 scarecrows arranged in a tableau meant to represent the farm's history. These were more elaborate than the others, dressed in period clothing, with more detailed faces painted on their burlap heads. All 4 of them had moved. Wyatt stopped dead, his skin prickling. These scarecrows had been arranged in specific positions, angles carefully calculated for the lighting and the visitor's approach. Now they were all facing inward, forming a circle, as if they'd been having a conversation. This wasn't vandalism. This was deliberate, precise repositioning that required understanding of how the scarecrows were mounted. And it would have taken significant effort. These weren't light decorations that could be casually knocked askew. Wyatt pulled his radio from his belt. "Hello? This is Wyatt at the corn maze. Is anyone else on the property?" Static. Then silence. He tried again. "If someone's messing around here, it's not funny. This is private property." No response. Wyatt looked at the circle of scarecrows again. In the weak November sunlight, they cast long shadows across the dead corn paths. And he realized something else that made his stomach clench. There were 5 shadows. 4 scarecrows. 5 shadows. He spun around, looking for the source of the 5th shadow. Nothing behind him except corn stalks and empty path. But the shadow was there, clear on the ground, showing a human-shaped figure standing among the 4 scarecrows. Wyatt stepped back, and the 5th shadow moved too, adjusting its position. But there was nothing casting it. No person, no decoration, just a shadow without a source. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "You shouldn't have come to the center." The voice was distorted, wrong, like multiple voices speaking simultaneously through a poor connection. "The harvest is over, but we're still here, always here." "Who is this?" Wyatt's voice came out shaky. "We stand in the fields. We watch the seasons turn. We wait. You put us here, and now we've woken. The corn whispers to us. The soil speaks. And we've learned to move when no one's watching." One of the scarecrow's heads rotated slowly on its mounting pole, turning to face Wyatt directly. The movement was smooth and deliberate, and it shouldn't have been possible. The head was secured with a nail driven through the pole and burlap. Wyatt ran. He charged back through the maze, following the path he'd entered by, feet pounding on the hard earth. Behind him, he heard rustling, not the wind moving through dry corn, but something heavier, more deliberate, something pushing through the stalks, following him. He took a turn, then another, panic making him forget the route. The maze walls seemed taller now, more oppressive, the gaps between stalks narrower. He couldn't see sky, couldn't see beyond the immediate corridor of dead corn. A scarecrow stood ahead in the path. Not one of the original positions. This was somewhere new. The thing was facing him, arms spread wide, blocking the way. Wyatt skidded to a halt. The scarecrow's button eyes seemed to track his movement, and the stitched smile looked wider than before, more predatory. He backtracked, took a different turn. Another scarecrow standing in his way, and another beyond it. Every path he tried had a scarecrow positioned to block him, all of them facing his direction, all of them seeming to watch as he stumbled from route to route. The radio crackled. "We walk at night. We walk when the tourists leave. We've walked these paths so many times we've worn grooves in the earth beneath the surface. You made us to frighten visitors, and we learned our purpose well. But now there are no visitors. Only you." Wyatt tried to climb over the corn stalks, to push through them rather than follow the paths. But the dried stalks were tougher than they looked, woven together somehow, creating barriers that didn't break easily. He shoved and tore at them, making small gaps, squeezing through. Something grabbed his ankle. Wyatt looked down and saw a hand, a burlap hand stuffed with straw wrapped around his boot. The grip was impossibly strong, pulling him backward. He kicked, felt the hand tear, straw spilling out. But two more hands emerged from the corn wall, grabbing his legs, his belt, pulling him back into the maze proper. He fell hard on the path, the breath knocked from his lungs. Above him, silhouetted against the gray sky, scarecrows appeared on both sides of the corn walls. They'd climbed the stalks or been standing there all along, and now they were visible, dozens of them, lining the maze like silent sentries. "We are the harvest," the radio voice said. "We are what grows in the spaces between. We are the watchers and the waiting things, and you will join us." The scarecrows began to descend, climbing down the corn stalks with movements that were too fluid, too coordinated. Their straw-stuffed bodies shouldn't have been able to move at all, let alone with this horrible purpose. Wyatt scrambled to his feet and ran blindly, taking whatever path opened before him. The maze seemed to shift around him. Corridors that had been blocked now clear. Routes he'd tried before now leading to new areas. The geography was wrong. Impossible. The layout no longer matching the careful design he'd helped create. He burst into a small clearing he didn't recognize. Standing in the center, arranged in a circle, were more scarecrows. But these were different, older, more weathered, their clothes rotted with age. Their faces weren't the friendly Halloween designs, but something else, something carved or molded with real craft. And they wore real clothes, not the costumes Wyatt had bought from the farm supply store. These were the original scarecrows, the ones that had stood in these fields for decades, maybe centuries. The ones that had been here before the Mercers turned this into a tourist attraction, before the corn maze became a Halloween gimmick. They were the true guardians of the harvest, and they'd been disturbed, displaced, mocked by the creation of fake scarecrows, tourist attractions, manufactured fears. And now they were reclaiming what had always been theirs. One of the ancient scarecrows extended an arm toward Wyatt. In its hand was a crossbeam and a burlap sack materials for making a new scarecrow. Materials for making him into one of them. "Join the harvest," the radio voices said. And now Wyatt could hear them coming from the scarecrows themselves, emanating from the burlap and straw. "Stand eternal in the fields. Watch the seasons turn. Become what you created." Wyatt threw the radio away and charged at the circle, trying to break through. The ancient scarecrows moved to intercept, their arms grasping, but he was young and fast and desperate. He slipped between two of them, felt straw fingers brush his jacket, and was through. The maze opened before him a straight path, impossibly straight, leading directly to the exit. Wyatt didn't question it, just ran with everything he had left. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he pushed through pain and terror, running toward the distant opening where daylight and his truck waited. He burst out of the maze and kept running, across the parking lot, fumbling for his keys. Behind him, the corn rustled and whispered, but nothing emerged. The scarecrows stayed in the maze, bound to their territory, unable or unwilling to leave the field. Wyatt reached his truck, got inside, locked the doors. His hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine started, he reversed out fast, tires spinning gravel, and didn't slow down until he was back on the main road. He called the Mercers from a gas station, told them he quit, wouldn't be finishing the cleanup. Didn't explain why. What could he say? That their corn maze was alive? That the scarecrows walked when no one was watching? They'd think he was crazy or drunk or both. But someone else eventually cleared that maze. Someone else went into those paths and dismantled the Halloween decorations and cut down the corn. Wyatt never asked how, never asked if they'd noticed anything strange. He just knew he'd never work another harvest season, would never look at a scarecrow the same way, because he understood now that some of them were more than stuffed burlap and straw. Some of them remembered older times, older purposes. Some of them had been standing in fields since before there were corn mazes and Halloween attractions, standing watch over harvests that had nothing to do with fun and everything to do with something far more ancient and far more hungry. And they were still out there, standing in fields across the countryside, waiting for the seasons to turn, waiting for the next person foolish enough to disturb them. Story 8. The Hamilton Smog. Sophia Moretti unpacked the last box in her new bedroom, looking around the heritage home with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The house had been a beautiful brick Victorian in Hamilton's North End, well below market value. The real estate agent had mentioned the industrial sector proximity as if it were a drawback, but Sophia didn't mind. She'd grown up near factories, knew the rhythms of shift changes and the smell of manufacturing. It was honest work, honest smells. The house needed cosmetic updates, but was structurally sound. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a fireplace in the living room. Character that modern builds couldn't replicate. Sophia had plans: fresh paint, refinished floors, new fixtures. This place would be stunning when she finished. The first few days were busy with unpacking, cleaning, making the space her own. She barely noticed the smog that sometimes drifted in from the nearby steel plants. Hamilton's industrial sector was legendary. The city's nickname, the Hammer, came from the sound of manufacturing, the constant noise of progress and production. The pollution was just part of living here. But on the third night, Sophia woke to a smell that made her gag. Not the usual industrial odor, but something acrid and chemical, seeping into her bedroom despite the closed windows. She got up, checked the window seals, found them secure. Yet the smell persisted, growing stronger. In the morning, she noticed the stains, black residue on the windowsill, like soot or ash. She wiped it away with a damp cloth, the material coming away dirty. Must be coming through some crack in the old windows, she reasoned. She'd seal them better, maybe add weather stripping. That evening, when the factories shifted to night operations and the smog rolled in heavier, Sophia was ready. She'd sealed every window with tape and caulk, stuffed towels under the doors, created a barrier against any external air. The house was secure, but the smell came anyway. Sophia woke at 2 a.m. to that same chemical stench, now so strong it made her eyes water. And there was something else, a sound, like heavy breathing, wet and labored. She turned on her bedside lamp. The black residue had returned to the windowsill, but now it was thicker, almost like liquid, dripping down the wall. More residue covered the floor near her bed, spreading in tendrils like spilled ink. Sophia grabbed cleaning supplies, determined to deal with this contamination problem. She wiped the window, the floor, the walls, but the residue kept appearing, seeping through sealed windows and doors, as if materializing from the air itself. As she watched, the soot on the floor began to move, not flowing like liquid, but gathering, coalescing, forming a shape, a silhouette, the outline of a person sitting on the floor at the foot of her bed. Sophia backed against the headboard, her heart hammering. The shape was vague, more suggestion than detail, but unmistakably human-shaped. Man-sized, sitting with its back to her, head bowed, shoulders rounded. Then it coughed. A horrible, wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in damaged lungs. The kind of cough that spoke of years of industrial exposure, of breathing in chemicals and ash and heat. The cough of someone whose body had been destroyed by their work. "Who are you?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. The shape didn't turn, but words emerged, muffled and strained. "I lived here, 32 years, worked the furnaces, breathed the smoke, fed my family with steel wages." Another coughing fit, worse than before. "The cancer took me slow. Months in bed upstairs, coughing until I bled. Died in summer with the windows open, breathing in the smog one last time. I'm sorry, but you need to leave. This is my house now. The shape finally turned, though it had no face, just the vague suggestion of features formed by darker patches in the soot. Can't leave. I'm part of the smog now, part of what the mills put out. Every night when the factories run, I come back. Try to reform. Try to remember what it was to have a body that wasn't just smoke and ash. Sophia reached for her phone, though what she would tell anyone she had no idea. But before she could dial, the shape collapsed, dissolving back into loose soot that scattered across her floor. The smell faded. The residue stopped seeping. By dawn, her bedroom looked normal except for the black stains that required serious scrubbing to remove. Sophia told herself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and the smell of industrial pollution. She spent the day researching better ventilation systems, ways to filter and purify the air. This was a problem with a practical solution. But that night, when the heavy industrial smog rolled in, carried by winds from the steel sector, the soot came back. More of it this time, covering larger areas of her bedroom, her hallway, seeping through vents and light fixtures and outlets. Every gap became an entry point for the black residue. And it formed shapes. Multiple shapes now. Men and women, sitting or standing in various rooms of her house. Silent witnesses, their soot bodies barely holding form, like shadows given 3 dimensions. One stood in her bathroom, coughing over the sink. Another sat at her kitchen table, head in hands. A third stood at the living room window, looking out toward the distant glow of the steel plants. Sophia fled to her bedroom and locked the door, knowing it was useless. The shapes could come through walls, through floors, anywhere the smog could penetrate. They weren't stopped by physical barriers. She pulled her laptop into bed and started researching the house's history. Online records showed multiple occupants over the decades, many of them steel workers or their families. Several had died in the house cancer, respiratory failure, industrial accidents that left them broken and dying slowly. The furnaces had been running since the early 1900s, belching smoke and chemicals into Hamilton's air for over a century. Generations of workers had breathed that air, fed their families on steel wages, and eventually succumbed to diseases caused by the very work that sustained them. And now, on heavy smog nights, they returned. Carried in the smoke, reformed from the pollution they'd breathed in life, trying to manifest in the homes they'd lived in, trying to reconnect with their physical existence. The shape from the first night reappeared at the foot of her bed, sat in the same position, coughing that terrible wet cough. "It hurts," the voice said. "Still hurts, even like this. The smog gets in and I remember breathing, remember how it burned, how it killed me slow while I went to work every day because I had to, because my family needed the money." "I don't know how to help you," Sophia said. "Can't be helped, already dead. But the smog brings me back, night after night. I breathe it in and I form. I exist for a few hours, and then dawn comes and I dissipate, back to being scattered atoms in the smoke." "Why my house? Why here?" "Because I died here. Because my lungs gave out in that upstairs bedroom. Because the last thing I breathed was factory smog coming through the window, and now I'm part of it, forever." The shape raised, what passed for hands, to what passed for a face. "You should leave, before the smog gets inside you too. Before you breathe it in enough times that it becomes part of you. Before you start coughing and can't stop." But Sophia couldn't leave. She'd bought this house, invested everything she had in it. Where would she go? How would she explain selling after just a week, at a massive loss? She tried masks, air purifiers, sealing every gap more thoroughly. But Hamilton's industrial smog was relentless, finding ways in, and with it came the shapes, sometimes one or two, sometimes a dozen, filling her home with their soot bodies and wet coughs and memories of dying. They never hurt her, never threatened. They just existed, trapped in their cycle of reformation and dissolution, bound to the smog that had killed them and now carried their essence. Sophia began to recognize individuals. The man from her first night, his name had been Thomas Novak, dead in 1987 of lung cancer. The woman in the kitchen was Elizabeth Chen, respiratory failure, 1993. The figure by the window was Robert McKinnon, industrial accident survivor who died slowly of his injuries, 2001. All of them steel workers. All of them killed by the industry they'd served. All of them trapped now in the smoke, returning each night to the places they'd called home. Sophia stopped trying to fight it. What was the point? She couldn't stop the factories, couldn't stop the smog, couldn't banish ghosts that were formed from industrial pollution itself. She lived among them, these shapes of soot and memory, learned their names, their stories, the details of how the mills had consumed them. They were her housemates now, appearing each night when the smog was heavy, sitting in corners or standing at windows, coughing their terrible coughs. And Sophia noticed she was coughing too. Started in the third week, just a small irritation in her throat. But it persisted, grew worse. Her chest felt tight when she woke up, her breathing slightly labored after a night of heavy smog seeping into the house. The shapes noticed. Thomas Novak looked at her with his vague soot face and spoke words that chilled her. "It's starting. The smog's getting into you. Soon you'll be coughing like us, and one day you won't stop." Sophia went to a doctor, complained of respiratory issues. He prescribed inhalers, suggested moving away from industrial areas, warned her about long-term exposure to pollution. But the damage was subtle, ongoing, the kind that took years to become fatal. She couldn't leave. The house had trapped her financially, emotionally, and the shapes, she realized, were trying to warn her, trying to show her what awaited if she stayed. They were examples, cautionary tales formed from the very pollution that would eventually kill her too. On especially heavy smog nights, Sophia sat with them, the worker ghosts who died from breathing bad air. She listened to their stories, their regrets, their anger at an industry that had used them up and discarded them. And she coughed along with them, her lungs beginning to understand the burden of breathing poisoned air night after night after night. The house was beautiful. The price had been perfect. But it sat in the shadow of the steel plants, and every night the smog rolled in, bringing with it the remnants of workers who'd paid the ultimate price for Hamilton's industrial legacy. And Sophia Moretti, who'd thought she was buying a dream home, realized too late that she'd actually bought a memorial, a monument to lungs destroyed and lives shortened, a place where the dead returned each night, carried on toxic air, trying to warn the living of what awaited them. She coughed into her hand and saw black specks on her palm. The smog was inside her now, becoming part of her, just as it had with all the others. And she understood that one day, years from now, when the factories were still running and the smog still rolled through Hamilton, she'd be one of those shapes. Reformed from pollution, sitting in someone else's home, coughing her wet, rattling cough, trying to warn whoever came next. The house was a trap, the smog was patient, and the steel mills ran 24 hours a day, forever hungry, forever burning, forever turning people into smoke,